Well, we'll go ahead and get started then. Thank you for joining us for today's genealogy program. I'm Jessica Ashton, and we're coming at you from the World War Regional Museum and History Center. Normally we're doing these from City Hall, but today we're doing a special live event in honor of International Women's Day. So today's topic will be celebrating women's rights. So for those of you who've joined us in person, thank you so much. Those of you who are tuning in, thank you so much. A couple of quick announcements just before we get started. We have a few more things happening here in March. So March 13th, we've got some exciting things happening. We'll be doing a soft open of our new exhibit, which is on the defunct schools in the area. And so our curator, Steve, has been working really hard putting this together. He's come up with many schools that no longer exist, some of them that you'll probably recognize and many that you might not. And so that will be mid next week. We'll be doing a soft open on that, and it's going to be really cool. So come down and see us, 612 Royal Birch Boulevard. And then just a reminder, the following week, starting March 19th, Pueblo Community College has its senior mini college. And so if you haven't had a chance to check that out, it's something you're interested in, there may still be space. There's a lot of classes on the lineup there, so check that out. And then March 27th, we've got community coffee and conversation here at the museum. And this month will be on Amateur Radio Club. So the club's been in existence here in Canyon since the 1970s. It's a pretty active club, really. And so it should be a good turnout. So if anyone has anything to contribute to that, or if you just want to come down and hear the conversation, please do. So that's March 27th. So today's topic, celebrating women's rights. Volunteer Terri Meeks has put together a wonderful program for us, and I will hand it over to you, Terri. Thank you.
Thank you. You haven't heard anything yet. Actually, maybe I should be grateful because you're applauding now. I might get the boos and hisses at the end. So, but thank you for joining us. March is Women's History Month, and President Jimmy Carter is the one that instituted that. So we want to thank him and recognize some of the women and actions that they had to undertake in order to get the right to vote, as well as other rights. I'm going to start with a quote. In the 1700s, women's rights were a concern. Abigail Adams wrote to John. Yep. And you see John's response. It was an uphill battle all the way. Yeah. So, in case you don't know or don't remember, what were women barred from that they were fighting for? We tend to think of women fighting for the right to vote, but they did not have, married women did not have the right to own land. They didn't even have the right to their own children. So we need to look at this list of things. She couldn't keep her own name. And we're going to see a case where even her basic freedom was in question. The idea of her not having rights to her own children is the idea, it's called coverture. And the idea is that a woman was covered by her father first, and then when she married, by her husband. So she had no personal identity of her own. So the husband and wife, when they married, they became one. And that one was the man. So it's important to see all of these. I have a bunch of newspaper articles. Don't read them all. We're just looking at them on a high level to show. But these newspaper articles come from 1899 all the way through 1948. 28 years after the 19th Amendment was passed. But women still didn't have full equal rights. Women were too sensitive to serve on juries. We didn't want to hear about all those terrible crimes that were being committed, so we couldn't judge. They were barred from the military and veterans groups, even though women were nurses in the Civil War. Women participated in the Revolutionary War, providing support. Women were sent overseas to Europe in World War I and in World War II. State and federal jobs. And heaven forbid you were married and wanted to be a teacher. And as late as maybe the 1970s, I believe, I have an acquaintance that was let go from her job because she became pregnant. She was married, but she became pregnant, and she was no longer asked to teach. Various sports. And they couldn't even go to saloons. Oh. And this is a very interesting book. This woman disagreed with her husband's religious beliefs and his teachings, and she was institutionalized, and she could not get out of that institution. And she was the one that eventually did get legislation enacted to protect women from these kinds of incarceration. Her husband initially walled her into a room in their house before actually committing her to a mental institution. And the doctors were in cahoots with him. And she lost the rights to her children and had to fight for those as well. So, in approximately the early 1830s, there were three movements that were gaining traction: slavery and the abolitionists, the lack of universal enfranchisement, so right to vote, and temperance. There was so much alcohol that women especially, were fighting for temperance legislation. Women were the victims of alcohol and alcoholism. Their husbands might beat them. Their husbands might spend more time at the bar and not at work. So they were left poverty-stricken and destitute. In some cases, the men just completely absconded and went elsewhere, leaving the woman with her children. How was she supposed to support them? She didn't have education. She was barred from that. So, in a lot of what we're going to see today, these three movements went hand in hand with one another. Most of the women that worked for voting rights also worked for temperance and abolition. This is the 1830s through the 1860s. So, The women especially wanted to address those social issues of poverty, ignorance, injustice, and while still maintaining the home. The women realized early on that the only way to get anything done was to have men as allies. The men were in charge of making and enacting the laws. So the only way to make any progress is to have some men on your side. So, and as we said, with the alcoholism or other sins of the time, how could the woman raise her children if she wasn't allowed to have his property? She wasn't allowed to have her children. And if it was just an abusive situation, not necessarily abandonment, what were her recourses? Virtually none. It's important to distinguish the difference between suffragist and a suffragette. So we're going to take a look at those. They're very, very similar, but it's a matter of degrees. A suffragist is one that believed in peaceful, constitutional campaign methods, that gave speeches, they gave lectures, they traveled to do these things, and they organized various meetings. This was when the start of women's clubs actually got started, and social meetings that got started at this time. So eventually they did form a national organization with a platform, and they did allow men to join. They knew where power resided. The suffragettes emerged from them because the suffragists, in their speechifying, didn't really attain their goals. The suffragettes were in a greater rush. They wanted the legislation to go through more quickly. So they were a little bit more militant in their actions. They did take action, and especially a lot of American suffragism election was based on England. And England at the time really did have some very, very violent actions. Women destroyed property, etc. So a suffragette was really out there. In the U.S., being called a suffragette was actually a pejorative term. It was offensive because of that militancy. And by the same token, there were a whole series of people, that men and women, who didn't want women to have the right to vote. So there were clashes between the two groups. Both really did have the same goal. They wanted political equality. They wanted the right to vote. They both used propaganda, whether it be lectures or banners, parades, posters, popular speaking, and each group thought that their method was more effective than the others. So, and here again, they wanted to influence the opinions of the important people, the men, to obtain the vote. This is really interesting to look at a little bit of history of voting in America. In the colonial times, white property owners. You had to own a certain amount of property in order to have the right to vote. As early as 1776, New Jersey, in their state constitution, allowed all adult inhabitants who owned that certain amount of land to vote. What's wrong here?
Women couldn't own property?
Married women could not own property.
Okay. I couldn't have gotten married.
That was an option. In the Constitution, white male citizens over the age of 21 and the rest of voting rights were left to individual states. And you will, I don't know that we'll actually see it, but you have to also understand that the individual states did have certain rights and did allow women to have certain rights in terms of voting. School boards were one of the areas especially where women finally did get the right to vote. And this is where New Jersey roars its ugly head again, because 30 years after they instituted everybody having the right to vote, in 1807 they took it away from the women. So while the women had it for 30 years, it went bye-bye in 1807. So by the 1820s, they were shifting completely over to white male vote, suffrage. Here again, no African Americans, no people of color in any way, shape, or form. And in 1848, we finally have the Seneca Falls Convention. And this was the first women's rights convention. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Because the country was growing, westward settlement was very important. Gold had been discovered in California, silver and gold here in Colorado. Not only that, they needed women to get married to all these miners, to cook food for all these miners. So in order to entice women to move westward, they dangled the carrot of voting in front of them. And it worked. In Wyoming, in 1869, they were the first state to grant suffrage to women. They did also allow women to hold public office. They could inherit property. In the early days, women had a dower right to their property. If their husband died, they got 1/3 of his property. All the rest went to their children. So she was protected as long as she was alive as a widow. But women now in Wyoming could directly inherit all of the property. And they did get guardianship of their minor children. They didn't have to apply to the court to be appointed guardian of their own children. Other states followed soon behind. After the Civil War, African American men got the right to vote. Here again, not women. And as early as 1878, Susan B. Anthony was the one that proposed the amendment for all citizens, regardless of sex, to vote. But it wasn't until 1920 that it was adopted. Washington and Montana, by 1912, these states also had allowed. Michigan starred because they decided to allow women to vote, and then they rescinded the idea. Nope, we're not going to let that happen. By 1917, 20 states had granted women the right to vote in the states. state contests, no presidential or federal elections. And finally, on August 26th of 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed. It allowed women the right to vote. It did not guarantee equal employment, equal pay, or many of the other considerations. So Dr. Alice Paul in 1923 introduced the Equal Rights Amendment. It hasn't been passed yet. We're 100 years later. Here's a map. It's actually from Canada. It's a 1917 map that does show where approximately the 20 states that are in white have agreed and voted that women have the right to vote. But what's really interesting is how long will it take the Republic of the United States? Or how long will it lag behind the monarchy of Canada? Even in 1920, when women were given the right to vote, not everyone could vote even after that. It did not take into account discrimination. So, African Americans, Mexicans, or people of Hispanic descent, Asian people were barred from voting by poll taxes, and even African American men after the Civil War, poll taxes, literacy tests, language tests, barred people. So we're going to see more about that. So it wasn't until 1982 that, for the most part, everyone finally did have the right to vote. So, we talked about we mentioned the women's first convention in Seneca Falls, and we'll go into that a little bit more in depth. But by 1872, we had the first woman to run for president. She didn't have the right to vote, but it was Victoria Woodhull, and she was the first candidate. She was from Ohio, and the Equal Rights Party nominated her, and I believe the Equal Rights Party had 5 delegates. And they nominated her to be the running mate of Frederick Douglass, unbeknownst to him. So there was controversy about her candidacy. Number one, because she was a woman, but she wasn't yet 35 years old either. So her candidacy did not go very far. By 1894, first women were voted to state legislatures, and that happened in Colorado. 1913 was the huge March on Washington. A group of women from all over the United States met, converged, and marched through the streets of Washington. 1916, we have the first woman congresswoman. Still didn't have the right to vote in national elections, but it was Jeanette Rankin, and she was a Republican from Montana, a western state where women had the right to vote for some time. And finally, 1920, when the amendment was passed. So, this is the honor roll that was taken at that 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. And we list the ladies, and we do also see gentlemen that were present at it. It was arranged by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and I believe also Lucretia Mott. And they had a platform that was very, very similar to the Declaration of Independence. They essentially rewrote the Declaration to make sure that all men and women were created equal. It's interesting to note Susan B. Anthony was not present, and the names are not, I scanned the names, and the Anthony name is not on there. Susan B. Anthony's mother and her sister did attend the convention, but apparently they didn't sign. A convention of indignant women. So what's interesting is the members have resolved that they have been, ever since Eve took the apple, trampled on, abused, sucked in, cheated, made slaves of, and received more cuffs than kisses, and that they will stand it no longer. So, pretty vehement for 1848 time frame. This is Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to be nominated for president. The first 3 women that were elected to the Colorado State House. The March on Washington. And this is actually a pretty good depiction because the parade that went through the streets was led by a woman riding a white horse. And she portrayed some mythical figure. I can't remember that. And she did have the trumpet. Elizabeth Rankin, our first woman legislator. And finally, some celebration. So the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 is what really kicked off everything. A month after the Seneca Falls Convention, there was one in Rochester. And if you know anything about geography, these two towns are pretty much close to each other. So in 1850, finally, Ohio Women's Convention, and it caught on. Individual states were now, women were gathering, they were getting together, coming up with lectures, and they were organizing conventions, whether they were on the state level or on the national level. So, they formed the National Women's Rights Convention, and that first major national convention was held in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850. And it became an annual convention from then on. A lot of these conventions were suspended during the Civil War, but they did continue. And as again, we realize that men were required to get the legislation enacted. So both men and women attended this convention. In her opening address, Paul Wright Davis called for the emancipation of a class, the redemption of half the world, and a conforming reorganization of all social, political, and industrial interests and institutions. So, during this convention, the women wanted equal civil and political rights. They did adopt the Declaration of Independence, and they demanded that the word male be stricken from every state constitution and make it for everyone. They also wanted the equal wages and employment opportunities. They wanted access to education. They wanted to ensure property rights and marriage, as well as the right to vote. One of the things was that you see on both sides of the fence is, and it harkens back to the Revolutionary War, representation, taxation without representation. Single women property owners were taxed on their property, even though they had no right to vote. They had no right to determine what those taxes were going to be. So that was one of the platforms. I find this very interesting. We want to be something more than the appendages of society. We want that woman should be the co-equal and helpmate of man in all the interests and perils and enjoyments of human life. We want that she should attain to the development of her nature and womanhood. We want that when she dies, she is not written on her gravestone that she is the relict of somebody, something left behind, the widow of. And I cannot tell you, we moved here from Fort Worth, Texas. I had a Sunday school group that I had a genealogy session with them. I asked them to fill out a 4-generation chart. And I made an effort to find something in their genealogy that they didn't know about previously. One of the first things I did was go to find a grave and look at cemetery headstones. There were probably at least 20 women in my living room. Not a single one of them had a mother with a tombstone with her name on it. This is in the 2000s. Their parents had probably died in the 70s, maybe. 70s and 80s. Not a single woman had her name on the tombstone. They were always Mrs. John Doe. So ladies, if you have a tombstone, make sure your name is on it. So what helped the change, and how was the nation developing? Two significant things really happened in the 1860s time frame. The Homestead was enacted, the Homestead Act, and it allowed women, single women, divorced women, deserted women, to obtain public land. They had the same restrictions, they had to improve the land, and there was a nominal charge for the land, and they had to work it for a certain number of years. But it opened up opportunity. Those women were moving westward, they were being enticed to come westward, but you also got land. Not only did you get the right to vote in some of these states, but you were going to be a landowner. The Moral Land Grant. This provided for the establishment of universities and colleges, and they could admit women. Women traditionally, if they were extremely well-to-do, might have received some education in their home via tutoring. They definitely learned the women's arts from their mothers. They learned how to cook. They learned how to sew. They learned how to decorate plates. But women were viewed as too fragile. Their brains might explode if they had too much education. If they had too much education, they were a threat as well.
Yes, I'm sure.
Interestingly, this is an 1858 picture of Julia Archibald Holmes. She was the first woman to climb Pikes Peak.
Oh.
And you have to think about fashion. Fashion was also important in the women's rights movement. She's wearing bloomers. Gone are the hoop skirts. Gone are the bustles. She's wearing bloomers. However, women are now wearing trousers. No. While many of the suffragists did adopt bloomers for a very, very short period of time, they realized that men were viewing this as being anti-feminine, anti-home, anti-family, and they realized soon that this strategy was backfiring. So in many cases, Susan B. Anthony did wear bloomers, but she gave them up right away because they realized the negative impact. So I'm very briefly going to talk about a couple of the women. And I probably will not talk about the men, but I want you to know their names and to also realize that women were working on the local level. This is a genealogy program. Was one of your family members involved in this kind of movement? We don't know those kinds of answers unless they were in the forefront of the movement. But what were their potential beliefs as far as the rights of women? Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she's the one that drafted the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. All men and women are created equal. And she paved the way for the first organized women's rights and women's suffrage movement. So, she was on her honeymoon in England in 1840, and she and her husband actually attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention. Here again, those three movements: temperance, slavery, and women's rights. She attended the meeting, and while women were there as delegates, they were told that they could not speak. They had to sit in a completely different area, and they were hidden behind a curtain so that they could not participate or give their speeches during this convention. William Lloyd Garrison was also at that convention, and he was the one man who stood up and sat with the women. So, Elizabeth did also found the New York State Women's Temperance Society, along with Susan B. Anthony. And here is a copy of the Declaration of Sentiments, which does read very, very similarly to the Declaration of Independence. During the Civil War, she founded the Women's Loyal National League for the abolition of slavery. So we've got those three movements working together. She did found the National Women's Suffrage Association, and she fought for equal rights, not just voting, but wages, property rights, custody, and ending slavery. We all know the name of Susan B. Anthony. She was born a Quaker, and part of the Quaker religion believes that everyone is equal under God. Her parents moved from Massachusetts to New York, and that gave her the opportunity to meet William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, both of whom were avid fighters for abolition as well as suffrage. As I mentioned, her mother and her sister also attended that 1848 convention, even though Susan didn't. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met in about 1851, and they became intimate friends. They worked together for over 50 years, working on the women's rights campaign. They gave speeches, they organized lectures, etc. And Susan, she gave approximately 75 to 100 speeches a year. So, remember that 1878 introduction of legislation for the women that voting would be open to regardless of sex? That was Susan B. Anthony. She paved the way for that 19th Amendment. She organized a women's suffrage convention in Washington, and this is prior to that big march in Washington in 1913. She had a publication that she routinely put into print in 1868 called The Revolution. And she, here again, that 1878, she arranged for that amendment to be presented, and it was actually introduced by a gentleman from California, Senator Aaron Sargent. Here's a copy of the newspaper that she published. Hygiene versus fashion. And this is the National American Women's Suffrage Association was the one that she helped found, but they are in 1902, they are having the first international women's suffrage conference in Washington, D.C. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Lucretia Mott was another Quaker, and her main platform was abolition of slavery. She organized the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, as well as other organizations. And this was what's interesting. She founded the first female medical college of Pennsylvania, and also worked to found Swarthmore College, which is a Quaker institution. This is the one. In June 1848, the Liberty Party National Convention named her to be the vice president. This is the one that had the 5 delegates, as opposed to Victoria Woodhull, who was the first president nominee, female. She became the first president of the American Equal Rights Association. And here again, it was for African American equality as well as women's equality. And this is Lucretia Mott. She was significantly older than Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony. I think she was born in the late 1700s. Sojourner Truth. She was an African American. She was born in New York State, upstate New York, as Isabella Baumfree in about 1877. And she escaped with her daughter from her owner in 1826. And she went back 2 years later to try and get her son. And she was the first African American woman to win a court case against a white man, at least in the state of New York. So, an interesting fact about her, she was born in that 1797 time frame in upstate New York. Dutch was her first language. She was an abolitionist, an activist for American African American civil rights, as well as the other 3 movements. And her famous speech came in the 1851 Ohio's Women's Convention. And her statement was, "Ain't I a woman? and it's an interesting speech to read. That's Sojourner Truth with Abraham Lincoln. She fought to have African American men fight during the Civil War and to form units for the African American men to participate for their freedom. Hannah Tracy Cutler, not so much on the forefront. She organized the Ohio Women's Suffrage. She wrote a newspaper, the Ohio Cultivator, which was essentially a farming magazine, but she wrote specifically for women. She actually drafted laws, and she organized with Frances Gage, Women's Rights Convention, and she gave a series of lectures in London that addressed women's legal rights. This was interesting. She drafted a law affecting married women's property in Illinois. This is the one I love. She argued before a joint House committee in Ohio for the woman's right to keep her own earrings. We think it's ridiculous, but this was the state of affairs. Women, they were covered, that coverture. They didn't own anything of their own. Frances Willard was an active temperance worker, and one of her big platforms was social reform. She was interested in education, public sanitation, getting the chamber pots out of the streets, and legal aid for women. So she had what was called a do-everything agenda, and she addressed much larger social issues that would be of interest to women. Ida Wells Barnett, another African American woman, her primary focus was abolishing lynching, which was very popular. And she was a journalist by trade. And as late as 2020, almost definitely 100 years later, she was awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for her investigative journalism. And this is one of her monographs that she published. Alice Paul, she's the one that was one of the primary organizers of the march in Washington. She too was a Quaker by birth. She was one of the ones that advocated for a constitutional amendment, and she is the one that introduced the Equal Rights Amendment right after the passage of the voting rights. The amendment was passed, and it had a 7-year deadline and has yet to be ratified. I mentioned this is a genealogy class. This is my grandmother's Aunt Dosha. She had a rooster named Susan B. Anthony. She had a Susan B. Anthony balcony. So I know that there's one person in my family that fought for women's suffrage. She fortunately did not die. She was born 1860 something, and she fortunately lived until 1947. So she did get to exercise her right to vote. So this is Ms. Emsley. She's one of the African Americans here in Colorado, organizing women's groups. So newspapers, They give you valuable information that might lead you to find one of your relatives. I had not seen that picture of Dosha Kumi until I started doing this presentation. So I knew she had, from the family letters, I knew she had the rooster, Susan B. Anthony. So, but other newspaper articles that women that were involved on the small and local level. This is a picture from the museum here. And it's a recreation, we believe it's sometime in the 1940s. The women are dressed up in period costume, but we see the little sign that the man is holding, Votes for Women, 1867. And I believe, I think this was Minnie Harding, who was a prominent resident here and established a scholarship for college students. And she was a suffragist. From the history of Colorado, we find in 1876 that suffrage and officers, and we find this whole list of people. The Reverend William Shepherd is from Canyon City. Magdalene Sheets was from Canyon City. So, on the local level, people are working for some of women's suffrage. There are posters. It was one of your relatives, one of the speakers, or an attendee. You have to go digging. They published cookbooks. The idea was, keep it women's focus, and so that you don't alienate the men, home life and the preservation of home life. So they did publish cookbooks. So we've got Mary Livermore, Lucy Stone, we've seen her name, Boston Great Bed, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Graham Bread. So the opinions are really mixed and varied. Some women did not want the right to vote, did not feel that they were, number one, interested and had the education to vote. If they paid taxes, maybe they should have the right to vote. But heaven forbid if you don't cook your husband's dinner. I'm not, she needs to be at home. She needs to pay attention to her family. No good suffragist should permit the cause to interfere with her home duties. Mrs. Rupp should have prepared her husband's supper before going out to speak. They can help the cause by proving that politics does not destroy home life. You're right. Finally, when the various states did ratify the right to vote, I believe North Carolina was the last that carried it over the 38, I can't remember, the required number of states. It had to be more than 20. So suffrage was enacted in 1820, but not all women did get that right to vote. And as I mentioned earlier, some groups were excluded, and they had to come up and form groups of their own in order to fight for voting rights. Native American women. Wasn't until 1924. Number one, Native American women weren't even citizens until 1924. So they didn't have the right to vote. Native American men didn't attain the right to citizenship either until very late. In many cases, it might have been as late as World War I. I don't remember. So it wasn't until 1924 that they were granted citizenship, and still in 62, they were being prevented from voting. Literacy tests, and in this particular case, the reservation residents. Yeah, that's an independent nation, not part of the United States. They used anything. Asian American, some of them did have the right to vote. Many of them didn't have the right to vote. And it wasn't until 1952, with the Immigration and Nationalization Act, that they finally got their rights. Latino women in Puerto Rico in 1929, literate women got the right to vote. All of them finally got the right in 1935. But it wasn't until 1975 where the Voting Rights Act finally allowed them. African American women finally got the right to vote in 1965. Those poll taxes and literacy tests banned them. We've talked about Alice Paul and the Equal Rights Amendment. It was written by Alice and Crystal Eastman, introduced in 1923, and support did resurface during the 1960s. It was finally reintroduced into Congress in 71, approved, and submitted to the state legislatures for ratification. Various groups, this is the National Federation of Business and Professional Women from 1956. They're advocating the Equal Rights Amendment. Unions were not in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. They felt that unions provided protection for women. And one of the slides that I have later emphasizes that even in the 21st century, where unions were looking out for women more than the federal legislation. So, jobs will grow in the 60s. World War II encouraged women to go out and work. So, but what did you have to be in 1960s to be a stewardess?
Yeah. Wow. Straight teeth.
Yeah. Straight teeth. You had to weigh less than 135 pounds. It was a graduated scale. The 135 pounds was if you were 5'9".
Wow.
If you were 5'2", it was significantly less than that. You know, oh, and heaven forbid you have a visible scar of any kind. But, and if you were a flight attendant before the age of 32, when you turned 32, you were let go. So it's, yeah. It was very, very interesting to me to learn flight attendants were always viewed as meal servers. It wasn't until 9/11 that the actual charter for flight attendants and their job description for the first time included the safety of the passengers.
That's a lot now.
2011. Here's a woman that finally did get the right to vote and was now advocating the Equal Rights Amendment. Governors running for office, this is Massachusetts, advocating. And we see more recent women marching. By 1977, 35 of the 38 required states had ratified it. There was wide support, but here again, the unions, it would disadvantage certain categories of women. Women could be drafted. Well, they've done away with the draft for everybody. They would jeopardize alimony and child support or child custody and those protection under labor laws. And the ratification deadline expired in 1979, so it's got to start all over again if they're going to do it. Briefly, there were women that bucked the system from day one, as early as the 1700s. The first woman allowed to vote in a town meeting. First woman teacher at an American college or university. So how did she get her education? First woman to get a medical degree. First female lawyer admitted to the Ohio bar. Once the women in Wyoming got the right to vote, Louisa Swain was the first one to cast her ballot. So, 1888, the New York Police Department hired their first female employees. They were maids. They cleaned themselves. They were not police officers. Lola Baldwin, finally, in 1908, 20 years later, was the first police officer hired. First woman to vote under the 19th Amendment. And there's a little bit of controversy about that. Was she really the first woman to vote? This woman is from my husband's hometown, Jerry Cobb. She was the first woman to complete all tests for space flight, but she wasn't allowed to go. She completed all the tests, but wasn't allowed to go. 1977, under Carter, benefits were approved for the World War I Hello Girls. These were women that served as telephone operators in World War I. They were on the front lines and in the trenches, relaying orders and communications from the generals that were in charge into the battlefield. And by the time the money was actually awarded in 1979, 50 women were left of the hundreds that had actually served. We have a first woman police chief and the first female Air Force fighter pilot. So women are breaking the rules and breaking the glass ceiling, as we say. This is from the 1990s.
I see.
This is me at work at Lockheed Martin in Fort Worth, Texas, on the F-16. And how many women do you see in that picture? So, I will say that when I retired in 2007, there were, I think we had 5 women. Yeah. So the fight continues.
It sure does.
Are there any questions?
I have one, Terry.
Yes.
I don't know much about Sojourner Truth. I've never really read much on her. When did her name change happen?
She believed, I don't know exactly when it happened, probably in the 1830s. She believed that God had come to her and told her that she needed to spread the truth about slavery and the movement. And so she actually chose the name Sojourner Truth.
Do you think think it was done legally or just?
I think she just changed it, yeah. And that brings up an interesting question. I'm pretty sure it was Lucretia Mott. Her house in Philadelphia was on the Underground Railroad. So these women were active in many, many things.
But do you feel like the majority of these women were opposed to slavery because they kind of internalized that they felt like slaves?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So, what do you think is yet to be done?
That's such a man question, Dan. Sorry. I apologize for him.
Equal pay for equal work.
Yeah.
It's still,
Um,
it's been a battle forever.
Uh,
I think it's a tough one though. It's a tough one because you're not equal. Well, yeah, some jobs.
Well,
Yeah.
and in some cases, maybe women are the superior.
Well, no, yeah, sometimes.
So,
There's still a lot of work to be done.
Oh, yeah.
yes. Employment, hiring, attitude. If we could, I don't want to use the word conciliatory, but if people were willing to compromise, in some respects, women, especially those that are militant, need to be able to look at the other side equally and fairly. Men also need to look at the other side equally and fairly. As mothers of sons, I think that perhaps we should do a better job of acquainting our sons with the history, where we have been, how far we have come, and at least establish a dialogue with them.
Seems like there's a lot of religious and denominations that still women are barred from being pastors, deacons, and other religions, head coverings, and all this other stuff. So there's a lot of work.
You know what else too I was going to say is that the women that were fighting, the militants or whatever, however you want to call them, I don't think that the percentage of women was that high. And
No.
I think that's why it was so difficult for them.
Yes.
I mean, I don't even know how much you think, 10%, 20? I know that it wasn't all of them. I think most of them were afraid to let go of what they had. If they had good marriages and nice homes and stuff.
Well, and even if they didn't, they didn't have the education. They didn't have the wherewithal to go out and, what kind of job were you going to get? When I went to college, there were very, very few choices. You might become a teacher, a librarian. You could go to business college. There were a lot of merchandising, buying and selling stuff.
Yeah.
There were not as many opportunities as exist today.
Terry, I think one of the biggest things that could improve, and it's like a whole society to do it, is respect for one another. I'm in my 70s now, so in the 80s and the 90s, and even like something when I was a younger adult, out in the working and everything, some of the disrespect, and this is still true, that women had for men, just because they were men, not because that guy over there is a whatever, because they're a man. And the same the other way. If we would stop that, things, of course there are people who are terrible on either side, but
Exactly.
it doesn't mean all men aren't, it doesn't
next month, we will return to Zoom, and we're going to take a look at directories, not just city directories, but other kinds of directories, and what kinds of information you might be able to find to enhance your family history story. In June, I will be doing another live presentation here at the museum, and that one will be on the Civilian Conservation Corps, the program that Franklin Roosevelt started during the Depression, and all the unemployed men that were able to obtain work and the various projects that they worked on. Some of them right here in Colorado. So, thank you.